because I myself actually just started grad school. I applied, I think it was back in June. I applied for grad school and I went through the whole admissions process as well. So I think like for listeners out there, really, I can see the challenges that they face and like their questions and concerns related to the applications process and how it's like dealt with from an admissions point of view. But really, before like going into that further, I always like to understand from a guest's point of view, really, like what is it that they do. And you mentioned that you kind of worked on both sides of the court, really. You were an admissions.
Reader, I was specifically my goal was reading. There are different job titles. There's admissions counselor, there's dean of admissions, there's
Mhm.
director of admissions, and within each position there are just various responsibilities depending on the title.
Okay, so you were a college admissions reader. Like, what would you say that job like entails, like day to day? Like, if someone asks you, like, what is it? Would you say you do on a day to day basis?
For the reading position in particular, is you're required to read a certain amount of applications per day, to take notes on that application, to write commentary. So that's the bulk of the job. And then depending on the school, they'll reserve like one day a week or a couple of days a week for committee meetings in which you'll discuss the most compelling applications or the applications on which certain readers may have disagreed.
I really want to dive into like the thought process and the criteria of that, but really just to preface here, is this a career that you found to be of interest to you growing up? Like, was there a specific time that in your childhood or growing up that you thought to yourself, well, this is kind of what I want to do? Or was it more of a career that you kind of fell into at some point, do you think?
Something that I fell into because I think a lot of people don't realize that this is a career in itself. I think a lot of people are under the assumption that, admissions work is either done by, some high level bigwigs or by professors or maybe by some sort of robot or something. Um, but it actually is a very deep and broad profession.
When you say it's done by people and it's not done by robots, this isn't as though you're applying for a job and they take your resume, put it into a system, and it looks for keywords to see if you fit the criteria for that grad school. Like each application has to be handed over to an individual to read through and pick and choose based off some criteria and determine whether or not that student or prospective student really goes on to the next stage of the interview process, right?
Idea behind schools that participate in holistic admissions.
Meaning,
So certain schools do more robotic, automated application screening. For example, the Cal State system here in California is pretty much a cutoff. If you meet the criteria, you're in. If you don't, you're out. But there's a, excuse me, there's a subset of schools that do holistic admissions, and within that, the goal is to give every application at least one, sometimes two reviews by a person.
okay, so it's kind of providing more or less a objective point of view as opposed to having one single person becoming the determinant of whether or not an individual kind of goes on to the next stage of the process.
Yeah, except I personally wouldn't use the word objective because there's always a human behind it, and humans can only be so objective.
What kind of have been your experiences though as a application reader? Because I mean, as a prospective student and applying to colleges, like I can kind of empathize with students because uh, I think they put a lot of pressure on themselves, whether it be going into an undergrad university or into grad school, because they're putting themselves up against however many, I'm assuming probably in the hundreds of, or thousands of people that are applying. And it's like, well, how, how am I going to get picked compared to all of these people? And like, are they going to actually consider all aspects of my life, or are they just going to say, well, this person has this SAT score, they're next, and then this person's like application gets dumped in the trash, so to speak?
It's somewhere in between the first thing you said and between the second thing you said. I think when you're working for a school that processes large volumes of applications, it's not so much that they're going to dump you because you have a low this or a low that. It's
Mhm.
that they're going to look for specific criteria that they've kind of developed throughout their times into what makes that student great for X university. And they're specifically looking for those things. And if an application doesn't speak to those criteria that have been set forth, then it becomes very challenging for the student to make it past the initial stage.
Okay, that's pretty interesting that you say that it has to speak to that university. So, are you saying that each university has like a certain ideal of what they're looking for? So, for example, one university says we pride ourselves on being very quantitatively focused or qualitatively focused or more inclusive or this, that, or the other. Are those kind of the things you're talking about when a student submits or a prospective student submits an application and writes an essay? They want to be looking out for those specific keywords that pertain to that university?
More or less, yeah. A lot of universities, particularly small private ones, pride themselves on developing an ethos. They have this like genre or this category that they want to keep uh, building upon because that's what's going to set themselves apart from the hundreds of other schools. It's almost like business or branding, right? Every business, no matter what you know about it, has spent lots of time and energy developing their brand, developing their reputation. And to an extent, colleges fall under that category too. So in trying to maintain that atmosphere, maintain that environment, they look for a lot of students who fit those criteria.
So, in your own experience, I'm assuming you've kind of read through thousands, if not more, of these applications that are submitted by students. Is there typically something that you see most often or commonly see across all applications? Because, like, when I'm thinking about it, if I was put in the position in which I was an application reader, I would feel as though like a lot of them would be extremely redundant, so to speak, because they would be trying to convey that they match or their ideals align with what the university brands themselves with.
Find that they would align with those criteria. You would
Yeah,
expect that.
yeah. So like in my own opinion, like if there was a bunch of students applying to like some university, like in my mind, I would think, well, wouldn't they just write their essay to match with what the university's branding is?
Um, you know how you first approach this conversation like kids don't really know and they're applying to hundreds of schools or whatever, dozens of schools.
Uh huh.
And the applications kind of come across that way. They come across as very generic, like these are my grades, this is my after school activity. And they're presenting themselves in such a way that it just kind of blends in with everybody else. The whole goal is like you were looking for kids, especially since I work for smaller schools, we were looking for kids who fit what we were looking for. And you would expect that you get a huge chunk of applications that spoke to that, but in reality, it really wasn't that way. There are the most essays, most applications tended to be very generic, very run of the mill, and there was nothing that really like stood out.
Mm. That's really interesting. That like goes against like my whole thought process on how individuals typically submit their applications. So if that is the case, Joey, would you what would you say is kind of the best practice when it comes to setting yourself apart when applying to undergrad or grad school in general? Is there something that you should typically aim to add to your application to set yourself apart from other students?
It's not that you need to add something to your application. This is where the whole counseling part of my background comes in. It's that checking with students to make sure that they're absolutely clear on what they're looking for in a school. I think a lot of kids approach this process as like, okay, they look at the top 10 schools based off of some random ranking website, and they're
Mhm.
like, okay, I'm going to go after these top 10 schools. When in reality, each of those top 10 schools have very little in common with each other. And so when you apply to those schools, you run the risk of looking very generic because each of those schools has something different about them. And so I kind of look with students and go from the other end. It's like, what is it truly that you want? What is it that you value? What is it that you need? What are your goals? And then I kind of go from there because if they can speak truly to who they are, then if that matches what the school is, then it'll come across.
Wow, I'm kind of surprised. That's a really borderline profound way to look at it because authenticity, at least what I'm learning recently, is more critical than anything when it comes to kind of achieving your goals or finding things that really align with you. So when a student needs to go out there and look at it as much as they're interviewing the school, much like the school is interviewing them, it gives them a better chance of finding something that matches with their identity. Because, like you said, I think a lot of people just rank schools based off, well, is this school a top 10 in this field or that field? And then they apply based off that, as opposed to saying, well, is this school going to really match these certain criteria? Am I going to check this off the list? As opposed to, well, it's just a top 10 school, so I might as well apply. And I think there's that like huge challenge or confusion. And it seems like what you've done in your counseling work is helping students align what it is that they truly feel inside to what the school offers, right?
It gives them a sense of agency, particularly because a lot of the students I work with aren't necessarily the best demographic to be applying to certain schools. And I think that's part of it is that, certain schools have institutional priorities and the type of students they want on campus. And when you're a really, really selective school, you cannot admit a large chunk of California kids. It's just impossible.
You mentioned the word as institutional priorities. What do you mean by that exactly?
So this kind of aligns with the mission statement of certain schools. Let's take the University of California system, for example. Their institutional priority is to serve students within the state of California. That's one of their main targets. Um, and that's true for any flagship state university. For example, University of Michigan, University of Texas at Austin. They're all really, really popular schools from my California students' perspective. But each
Mm.
flagship state university is serving their own state students. So number one, there's not a lot of space for out-of-state students. And number two, if you get in, you're going to have to pay out-of-state tuition.
It's kind of in their best interest to serve those that are in the immediate community to them.
The public school is supposed to do, right? And then there's certain private schools, right? Certain private schools, like all women schools, they have their institutional priorities. They want to recruit women or people who identify as women. There are other schools that are STEM schools that, they have their institutional priorities. Other schools have a certain like cohort of spots open to athletes because athletics are part of their institutional priorities. They generate millions of dollars of revenue from sporting events.
Wow. So a couple things here, and we'll just start off like on the first one, and that is, do you think in reality that some schools are really better than others, or is it really just a matter of what that school's identity is? So, for example, like you look at MIT, and they're renowned for their mathematics and engineering and computer science, whereas I believe Stanford or Harvard are renowned for their business program. So it really raises the question, is one school really better than the other, or is it a matter of like what they focus on as an emphasis for their identity?
Yeah, so when you're trying to rank better, right, that's such a subjective criteria. And I truly do not believe that you can rank a school as better or worse, particularly when each student also has their own unique needs and identity. Um, they've done all these studies on like making sure that if you go to a school, you don't necessarily want to be drowned out by a bunch of other high achieving students. So let's say you are able to get into a highly selective school
Hmm.
and you're only able to do mediocre or less than mediocre, is that necessarily better than you going to maybe a less selective school and being in the top of your class? Um, so it's a really hard question. So maybe objectively, yeah, they have a large endowment. Maybe objectively, their professors have X number of Nobel medals.
Hmm.
right? But does that make that school better for you as a student? That's kind of the question I ask students.
That's a really good question, Joey, and I think there's a lot of bias when students are making those decisions or prospective students because I hear a lot of people talk about getting an MBA, and it's like, well, you shouldn't apply to get your MBA unless you're applying to a top 10 school. So you look at Wharton, you look at Booth, for example, and it's like if you're outside of the top 10, then don't bother applying because employers aren't going to look at many of those other schools as competitive enough when they're looking to hire people out of grad school. So you give an example of, well, one school might fit one student more so than just looking at a top 10 school. So I'm really curious, like, what are your thoughts on that? How do people reconcile looking at top 10 colleges versus run-of-the-mill colleges when it comes to their prospects after graduation?
Yeah, so you bring up the interesting analogy of MBA. MBA and other master's programs, I think, are slightly behind in terms of undergraduate, in that ranking and reputation is huge. Um, versus undergrad, the whole goal for students is that rankings aren't nearly as important. For example, for computer science, all they need to do is be able to pass a coding interview, and you can develop those technical skills going to an undergrad institution or not even going to an undergrad institution these days,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are coding boot camps in which, as long as you work really hard and get an intuitive understanding of coding, you can pass a coding interview. Um,
Hmm.
so it really depends on an immense amount of research and looking into what some of these schools are offering. And so, in trying to combat with some of these highly renowned schools, some of these lesser schools are devoting a lot of energy, a lot of resources into developing programs that will help students succeed. So it could be career resources, it could be undergraduate advising, it could be a co-op program where they work with helping students get internships. There are a lot of these other facilities, other programs that some less renowned schools do offer for students that can be something that maybe a less competitive student would really benefit from.
Mm. That's a really interesting point. I know at least the grad school I'm going to, like they focus a lot nowadays on innovation and they have built up a lot of different programs around that specific interest. And I mean, ASU has, I mean, they call themselves number one in innovation, Arizona State, and they have a lot of different startup environments there. So I can see where a lot of these colleges are starting to at least try to level the playing field
Hmm.
by putting a greater emphasis on specific areas that some of the top colleges are, I guess, putting forth. But you mentioned that like grad schools are kind of behind on that. Like, can you elaborate? What do you mean by that exactly?
It's that within the field of law and MBA particularly, there still is that notion of like go to a top 20 school or don't go at all.
Where
And
does that come from?
I think it's just kind of this long ingrained thing. Like this whole thing is still around for undergrad. When I talk to parents, the idea even from like 20, 30 years ago is that, if you don't go to a top 50, top 20 school, you won't get hired. And that's honestly not the case in the United States of America, at least. Especially if you look at the percentage of people who hold a bachelor's degree or more. I think the number is like in the mid 30%. Like what are the other 60% of people doing then? Not working. That's not true.
Do you think like a bachelor's degree is kind of? I know you said it's 30% of individuals have that degree now, but like when I hear people talk about it, it's always talked as though, oh, everybody has a bachelor's degree and there's little to no value on that. So unless you have a master's degree now, you're not really in the competitive space. So like there's always that, I guess, dissonance really when it comes to like what is marketable in these current conditions.
It really depends on the industry, right? So for high level business, like if you want to become Fortune 500, corporate, whatever, then
Mm-hmm.
yeah, MBA is necessary because that's just such a traditional route. All these businesses are run very traditionally. It's hard for these large scale organizations to pivot and, adjust. Versus if you're doing a startup, like you mentioned MIT. I was just watching a documentary yesterday about how a bunch of MIT students dropped out to form a video game company. It's just that's just more along the lines of if you have the skills of getting into one of these schools, you don't need a bachelor's per se. And same with graduate degrees. You don't need graduate degrees necessarily if you have some of these other skills like creativity or innovation.
It's funny you mentioned that. I remember reading an AMA on Reddit, I think a couple of months back, and there was this student that dropped out of MIT, I believe. He had a coding background, and what he did was he went out to San Francisco, I think, or California, and he started his own coding college or university.
Hmm.
And the basis behind it was the students would learn how to program, and they wouldn't have to pay tuition at all
I bet this is make
until
school then. Is it make
exactly
school?
that's it,
Yeah.
make school exactly.
Hmm.
I was like, this is pretty cool. It just kind of goes to show that nowadays people don't have to rely solely on a traditional education through an undergrad university or a grad program to get the skills they need to do what they want in life. I mean, if someone could drop out of college, I mean, look at Bill Gates, and I know he's just an extreme example here, but Bill Gates dropped out of school. Steve Jobs did. Richard Branson didn't make it past, I think, like elementary school or high school or something. And all these people managed to start these really incredible enterprises. So, especially in this time, like it kind of gets like really confusing when there's COVID and people are wondering, well, do I apply to school? Do I skip? Do I just go do my thing? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Because it just goes to show like people can just do things themselves now.
It really is. And like Google started releasing their own like specialization certificate program.
Hmm.
They're trying to combat this idea of needing a four-year institution. And I mean, I would argue that school isn't necessary for people unless they're really looking for to build a technical skill, whatever that technical skill is. It could be engineering, it could be coding, um, or it could be like, pre-med if they want to become a doctor. You absolutely need skill. Um, but the other reason that you might want to go to a four-year college is for the network. The only reason that I even like consider some of these highly selective East Coast schools for students is so if they want to work in corporate America, work for a hedge fund or something. I'm like, okay, fine, go out there and burn yourself out after a couple years.
Hmm.
Um, but beyond that, what really is the need of a four-year degree? I wonder about that myself because a lot of my students, in Orange County, there's a wide variety of income levels, and some of the most affluent families come from very modest backgrounds. Some of my students' parents didn't go to school, or some of them just went to their local state school and are, multimillionaires. Like,
Hmm.
and it's funny that they were able to make something out of nothing, and then that they're kind of pushing for their kids to go to something highly selective, maybe because they never had that chance themselves.
Yeah, that is just absolutely crazy. I hear these stories all the time where people don't complete college. Even some of the most like, even some of the less renowned individuals, like they end up becoming multimillionaires just starting random businesses of marketing or selling certain products. And again, like it just goes to show how people can really just make something of themselves. So at the end of the day, like, is it becoming, or is it really just a stigma that people need to go to college to achieve something? Is that something that we're just taught from a young age that unless we go to college, we're not going to get that job, we're not going to make enough money to survive or buy a house or buy a car or what have you?
Yeah, it is. It's kind of baked into our culture. It's baked into a lot of cultures around the world, right? You need a four-year degree, and they have done the studies, and statistically, you will make more over the course of your lifetime, statistically.
So it's really just playing the odds here. Like, do I take the chance of starting a company without a degree, or do I hedge my bets on going to a college, getting that 4-year degree, and then just going into corporate America and hoping that you kind of made the right bet, really.
Yeah, and so for kids, like honestly, part of college is also just like being able to grow and mature in an environment where, you can make mistakes without like suffering really big consequences. And so a lot of the conversation comes down to is like, do you really need to spend $60,000 a year to do that? Or, can you do that at a place where it's not going to cost you and your family as much money? And it really boils down to an individual decision because some
Mm.
families are fine with that paying that, whereas other students would have to take out the loan themselves. So it does not make any sense whatsoever to take out six figures in debt just so you can say that you had that experience.
Yeah, and the crazy thing about that is, like, I mean, in some cases you might have to if you're going to get a medical degree and become a doctor. You're gonna have to take out that six figures for that specialty degree. There's like no two ways about it because you can't just teach yourself to be a doctor. So in some of the cases, like you kind of are pigeonholed in that. But if someone, one of your students or people you're counseling ask you like, what do I do? Like, do I go to college, or if I have like a really good idea and I really want to pursue this passion or become like a pro gamer or my like a YouTuber, like what do you tell them if they have that question?
If they really want to become a YouTuber, then I'd challenge them to make a YouTube channel before they go and see how hard it is. You can totally be a YouTuber. You could totally be and make millions of dollars. You really could, but it's not just going to happen overnight. You can still work on your YouTube channel while you're developing a skill.
So you have to you kind of just challenge the student you're counseling to kind of be absolutely certain that like what they're doing or the decision that they're making is
Yeah,
the right one for them.
yeah. If you want to be a pro gamer, like how many competitions have you done so far? Oh,
Hmm.
none. Well, then go enroll in a tournament, right? I
Uh-huh.
don't care what kids want to do. You can do anything. Like people, I think we're in a interesting time where as long as you have any skill and can like make yourself an expert in that one skill, everything will come to you because people will look at to you as an expert and will pay you for your expertise.
That's a really wow. Okay, I like that kind of perspective when looking at it. Um, how have kids kind of reacted really to COVID 19? Like when they're thinking to themselves, well, all these schools are operating mostly remotely. I mean, it's really kind of an ebb and flow, really, what we're seeing here with some schools opening, some doing partial online learning, some remote learning, some fully in class learning. And you see, like, a lot of students questioning, well, do I just take a gap year or do I apply? Like, what have been your kind of impressions on that recently?
So for most of my kids, they're all fine going to school, but nationally speaking, there has been an increase in students seeking deferment. I think Harvard usually does like 70 to 80 students per year deferring. But
Hmm.
this year it was closer to 20% of their class. I think 70 to 80 is closer to 5% of their class.
Hmm.
Um, it's just a lot of families are finding that, paying full tuition for a non-classroom experience just doesn't cut it for them.
Hmm.
Which I can see, right? The biggest reason you go to some of these fancy schools is so you can meet some fancy celebrity's son or daughter.
Yeah, I think the picture I got, like, for why it's important for a student to engage in an in-class platform or to be on campus is so, again, like you said, they can network with people, they can experience what it's like to be independent from others, what it's like to learn in collaborative environments, hands-on and whatnot. Whereas if you're kind of doing it from remote, you miss out on the opportunities to network, you miss the college experience,
Hmm.
you miss like what it is actually like to be in person and learning, because some people learn better in person as opposed to learning online. So it really, the challenge from that really becomes like, is it really worth the cost, like spending say $70,000 a year to teach myself online when I can do it myself? Like it doesn't make sense anymore.
It doesn't for a lot of families, and so you'll see that they're still sorting out the numbers, right? Because school has barely started for some schools, and so
Hmm.
there has been an increase in deferrals or students just like not going to the first semester of college.
Do you think we're going to be kind of like seeing a shift, like where colleges realize, well, a lot of these students are deferring now because of COVID, and we don't know how long this is going to be. Like we don't know if the vaccine's going to be uh, viable enough. Like so, like what if into 2021, schools are still dealing with COVID-19? Like, do they realize, well, we can't really charge students X amount of dollars for an online experience? So do we have to like reassess and readjust how we're handling this, whether it be on a cost basis or how we're doing our delivery of our instructions to students?
I do think there's going to be some sort of reckoning. Colleges are starting to lay off a lot of the support staff, the non-teaching staff, dining staff, landscapers, that sort of thing, because it doesn't make sense to keep them on payroll when nobody's on campus utilizing those services. I
Mm-hmm.
think from schools that are more financially, what's the word, vulnerable, there's going to be a big reckoning for them. Either they're going to have to close shop or merge with another school. Um, and I'm curious too. I'm curious to see within next year how the shift of the demographic is going to be. It's either going to be that a bunch of kids are going to resort to education because the economy is so bad, or it's going to be the other way around that, the economy is so bad and people don't want to pay for college.
Yeah, I mean that's just like if the economy is just like tanked and it's expensive to go to college, well, I want to go to college, but I can't afford it. But is it worth going to college when the economy is not sufficient enough to
Hmm.
be hiring people? So people are kind of like really in a bad position, like with COVID-19. I mean, are schools going to have to like a drop the cost? Are they going to have to even furthermore? Are they going to have to like say to themselves, we're not getting enough students now? Are we going to have to drop our admission standards? Are we going to have to like assess students on a wider set of criteria and allow more students to come to our school?
Yeah, and so this is actually the conversation that some schools had been having before COVID hit, because I think the year 2018, the graduating class of 2018, was the most populous graduating class for the foreseeable future. A bunch of people aren't having kids anymore, because millennials don't have money to raise kids.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of colleges have already been having that conversation. I think this pandemic is forcing them to have this conversation faster than they anticipated.
Wow, that's crazy. 2018 was the most populous graduating class amongst all universities, and then do you think it's just going to keep going downhill from here?
Yeah, among high schools, and statistically, yeah, there are just not enough kids. We're on a downward decline in terms of birth rate.
Just like listening to this, like in my head, I'm thinking, well, if that's the case, a lot of these schools are either going to shut down or consolidate, and we're going to be moving over to a different form of education in the next 10 to 20 years, where it's just you have smaller community based learning as opposed to these larger institutions on a state level. Because like right now, like if you look at California, for example, like how from your perspective, how many California universities are there? Because there's there's University of California, I think schools, like there's just like dozens, aren't there?
Yeah, but proportionately, compared to the population, we have none. Like if you go
What?
to a state like Ohio, oh, I think Ohio has more universities than California does, even though their population
I,
is a quarter of the size.
that's mind boggling. Like every time I go to California, like I feel like I drive by a college every few miles, and it's insane. Like in Arizona here, we have like three main schools,
That's true.
and I mean, yeah, it's just crazy. Like I'm wondering in my head, like what is going to happen when if the economy tanks and people realize like they can get education elsewhere, and like is it going to cause a massive shift and force us to like rethink how we go about education, how we go about educating students to determine like what they want to do as adults and how they want to attain that knowledge for whatever interests they have in mind. Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that is I'm very curious to see, because people are putting all their resources online and finally being forced to invest their time in developing online programs. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a huge shift there. The thing that is has been happening in California prior to the pandemic is that the population and the number of schools, they didn't match with each other. So the number of college spaces within the state of California was
Hmm.
far too low for the population of high school graduates. So as a result, a lot of students had to go to consider school out of state.
Right.
So I think given this pandemic, California is not going to change much. It's
Mm.
going to be the other states like Arizona or maybe Ohio with all these little tiny private schools, in which those, yeah, a lot of schools are going to have to change their business model, change their education model, change something in order to survive. I wish I had more answers, but it's almost like every day I'm learning something new.
Yeah. I remember going to undergrad like 7 years ago, was it? No, 9 years ago. And it seemed like 10 to 15% of the population at our school came from California.
Where'd
And
you go to school?
University of Arizona.
Oh, okay, U of A, yeah.
Yeah, so I was thinking to myself, well, that really does put two and two together now. A lot of students came here because, like you said, there was just not enough schools to support the amount of incoming freshmen
And
into undergrad.
here's something that's interesting that I don't know where a lot of your listeners are, but within California, there's this association called the Regional Admissions Counselors of California, where the universities from out of state hire people to be located within the state of California so that students can easily access them, talk to them, interview with them. We have about like 50 plus counselors here that represent different schools. ASU has like 5 people out here. University of Arizona has like 4 people out here. You can just list any school and they probably have somebody out in California.
Whoa. So, I mean, do you ever have like statistics on like what the acceptance rate is for the admissions counselors or interviewees that go from other schools to California relative to like what the acceptance rate is for California schools? So, like in other words, has it been found that like out of state schools have been accepting more students from California than California schools themselves?
I would argue yes. I wish I had data to back it up, but the one of the main reasons is out-of-state tuition. Um,
Hmm.
if they accept the student, even if they pay $5,000 more after getting scholarships, right, the university nets positive.
Wow.
So I would be curious to see those statistics. Um, Ironically, I've looked at the statistics the other way around for out of states applying to the UC schools, and
Mm-hmm.
across most schools, out of state students get in at a higher percentage than in state students.
What?
I
That
know.
that is there. I'm trying to like picture in my head what the logic behind that is. Like, is there in your own experiences as a counselor, like, if you have any insight into that? It's like why that might be the case.
Well, the case is for an out of state student to apply to the University of California, they actually have to take an extra step that they wouldn't have had to otherwise.
What's the extra step?
To open a University of California application, write the essays, and apply. For students within California, it's just kind of a rite of passage. It's just part of graduating, right? You just do the application. And
Uh huh.
so a lot of students who are underqualified are applying because it's just one application. You send it to all the schools, right? So even if you're only academically qualified for UC Riverside, let's say, you would still apply to UC Berkeley just to try. You don't have to do any extra work. You just click an extra button, pay an extra $70 application fee. Um,
Wow.
on the contrary, if you're out of state, like from Minnesota or something, you have to do the extra effort. You want to make sure that you're academically qualified. So, the kids who are brighter and want to go to Berkeley so they can be in Silicon Valley, right? They have
Mm-hmm.
the grades, they have the extracurriculars to back it up. So I'm not surprised that the number's higher. It's just because more qualified applicants are applying and that fewer who aren't qualified are applying also. So that's why the numbers are a little bit different.
I see. You mentioned that like the combination of grades and extracurricular activities. Is there kind of like a standard for what someone should look to achieve and add to their application from that point of view? Like, I know there's the test scores, like at SAT, I think, and ACT, and then you have your grades, and then you have extracurricular activities like volunteering. Like, is there like a best practice for like how a student should set themselves up to make like a well-rounded application on in that context specifically?
So it will boil down to what the student really wants to do. For
Mm-hmm.
most majors, it doesn't make a difference what you do as long as you're participating somehow. You're engaging outside of class, you're doing volunteer work,
Hmm.
I don't know, whatever. There's a handful of majors where then you want to specialize a little bit more. For example, nursing. It's one of the most impacted majors here in California. They really want to see people who are passionate about nursing aren't going to change their mind because, like, for example, UCLA nursing has a 2% acceptance rate.
Two.
They're 2%.
Wow.
They're not going to admit somebody who's wishy-washy in their application about nursing.
So that's kind of like the purpose for why there's criteria around having the extracurricular activities because they want to make sure that that student is going to be fully committed to that program. So if I'm going to a nursing program, I better show that my extracurricular activities are around the topic of healthcare and helping people in some way or another that shows my commitment to that area.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be within healthcare per se, but showing that commitment to like helping people. So it could be volunteering at a senior citizen center. It could be helping out with, a homeless food drive, something like that. And being able to eloquently describe your commitment to the field because they'll be asking you why do you want to do nursing. That's just part of it. So it's not just nursing. It'd be engineering or computer science. That's another one of the most impacted majors here in California. And then for certain schools, it's also business, depending on how selective the business program is.
In your own experience, when like you're reading a lot of these applications, did you notice that a lot of them had these extracurricular activities, or were they all like pretty run of the mill and standard without them?
The students were pretty standard. So, I mean, I worked for schools that really didn't specialize in nursing or in coding, so I didn't get to see as many of those applications. I do remember one kid once, he was super like he was bound for MIT or something. And then you could tell just by all the things he'd done, and we're reading this application like, oh my God, this kid's a rock star, but we can't admit him. Um, he wouldn't do anything at the school, right? He would be like coding, but there weren't enough coding classes for him to do well.
Hmm.
Um, so what what was your question? In reading those, what would I see? At Claremont, it was a lot of leadership. So we saw a lot of like volunteering for congressmen, senators, that sort of stuff. So that was
Mm.
pretty traditional. And at Northwestern was a very artsy school, as well as engineering. So we would see some engineering, just like internships, and we'd see a lot of kids who did like theater, dance, that sort of stuff.
You mentioned that you couldn't accept the student because you didn't have enough coding related programs or courses. Like, is that a situation where you'd go to the kid like and say, "Listen, man, like you're way overqualified for this school, and we have nothing to teach you here. You're better off applying to MIT." Like, did that conversation occur?
I really wish those conversations would occur more often. I'm sure he applied to MIT and stuff. Um, it's just with the volume of applications, it's just impossible to do that personal touch, which is kind of sad from my
Mm.
perspective. I remember a couple years ago, I still do like interviewing for Northwestern as an alum.
Hmm.
And I just remember this one girl, she was not in the best situation. She was just applying to Northwestern because she thought that's what she should do. And she was just completely off mark, applying to the wrong sorts of schools, asking the wrong questions. And I'm like, I told the admissions office somebody needs to reach out to her and help. And I'm pretty sure that they didn't. I just wasn't in a position to personally help her. But I do think that that's these like really well endowed schools have these counselors whose primary goal, honestly, is to work with students. And I feel like that's where sometimes the ball gets dropped.
I mean, yeah, education is just so underrepresented and I guess undervalued in that sense. I mean, my significant other, she's a teacher herself, and I always happen to wonder, like, where is that, I guess, human connection? Like, in some ways, I honestly feel that students are really just treated as numbers and aren't provided the guidance that they really need to kind of get to where they want to in life. And it's just like I think that's an area that can be improved really. And you kind of alluded to that really with the individual at Northwestern not getting that actual conversation because if they're so out of place, like it's important to help that person because they have so much potential in themselves and like at least help them to achieve that elsewhere, you know?
That was kind of my experience going to Northwestern too. They fixed it now. I went to school from '04 to '08,
Hmm.
and being like the first in my family to go to school in the US, my
Oh,
mom
wow.
didn't. She went to school in Asia. I was kind of just like wandering about trying to figure things out myself. And this, billion-dollar endowment school didn't have resources to teach me that I needed to apply for internships over the summer. Like I didn't know to do that. And all my friends were getting internships. I'm like, how'd you get this internship? It's like, oh, I just applied. I'm like, what? Wow, where? How? Um, so that's actually kind of how I fell into what I did is what I do is because I kind of wish somebody had been there to tell me, hey, maybe you should apply to this program or maybe you should consider this major. I majored in math. I took 12 classes in math. I love math. I learned nothing.
Really? You learned nothing out of all of those courses in mathematics?
It was just so high level. It was so like not applicable to anything that I wanted to do. And I just felt like I had to finish it because I'd already committed. That was like six classes and I'm like, well, six more, whatever.
I'll be honest though, it's admirable the work you do because I think it is such an important line of work to help students achieve their goals in life and to provide that guidance because that is an aspect that is missing so inherently in the education system. And I honestly wish that there was kind of a solution or whatever, a piece of software or something, a program that really focused more on providing that guidance for whether it be scholarships, internships, postgraduate work opportunities, something like that. I think it's an aspect of the education system that is just really lacking, Joey.
It's kind of piecemeal right now. There's a bunch of people trying to like fill in little gaps here and there. There's like one website for scholarships. There's another one for like internships, but they're just like, it's like my job kind of as this counselor is like, okay, figure out what all these things are and give them to my students when they need them. Yeah, it is.
Mm.
It is kind of frustrating.
One of the aspects that like a lot of people talk about when applying to schools on that note is the ACT and SAT, and there's always a lot of questions around it, or like, what do I need to score to get into college? Which one's the better test to take? Is this exam really necessary? Because I assume that an exam isn't really the sole indicator of someone's intelligence. I know that there's a lot of different things that show how intelligent someone is, or if they can fit into a program. Like, what are your thoughts on that exam, like in terms of the application process?
So I'm biased in that my background is in test preparation and I've worked with lots of kids on preparing for the test. So from having worked with those students, I can see how sometimes their gaps in understanding how to take the test can translate into gaps in their education. I can truly see that, but I can also understand that not everybody needs those skills to succeed in college or in life. One of the biggest skills that's tested is like formal grammar. And so for a student who wants to be a marketer, a writer, a lawyer, something like that, I can absolutely see the connection between proper grammar and, success further down the road. Um, Also quantitatively, right? If you can critically think about numbers and equations, obviously that's going to be crucial for engineering or any other sort of like economics or actuarial science, something like that. Beyond that, though, the value of the test starts to drop dramatically.
Wouldn't it be more viable or applicable for schools to develop a test relative to what their ideals and focuses are? So, for example, here, Joey, let's say there's school A, and they're very passionate about engineering and mathematics. Wouldn't it be better to just for them to have an exam that is focused on quantitative aspects, and then if you have like another school that's focused on grammar or let's just say politics or law or writing, they'll have an exam for incoming students to take that's more in and around grammar and writing and logic and critical thinking, because right now it's as if we're forcing students who are a circle into a round peg by forcing them to do, I guess, exams that aren't really in line with their type of thinking. We want to encourage students to, I guess, put forth their best foot relative to what they're good at, you know?
I completely agree. And this is just my little conspiracy theory, is that College Board, multi-billion dollar nonprofit organization,
Uh-huh.
um, is that it isn't in their best interest to put all these resources into developing too many of these tests. I completely agree. This is kind of how China does it. Like you take this college entrance exam in one of three areas, right? Humanities, STEM, and I can't remember the third one. But that's how they do it. And I think, okay, so I don't know if you know this, but the University of California system is dropping the SAT requirement for students in 2023 and beyond. And they're hoping to come up with their own alternate version of a entrance exam. So I'm hoping, because this is the largest university system in the whole country, right? I'm
Hmm.
hoping that with their search for a new type of exam, that what you're saying is going to happen.
Whose input do they take on this though? Like, are they asking admissions counselors? Are they asking the educators, the teachers, the professors, the students, like what their thoughts are on this? Because it just seems kind of, I get it. They're trying to help, and I really admire that they're actually putting forth the effort to reassess and evolve from a really old exam to something that is going to be more in line with what students really should be taking. But are they taking the necessary feedback and input from educators?
When you're saying they, are you talking about like the people who decided to drop the exam for the University of California?
Yeah, exactly.
I think what they've done a lot of validity studies on the test, and the biggest correlation between high test scores is between high test scores and wealth.
So you're telling me that those who have the financial ability to afford test prep is more associated with those who get in or pass the exams with high scores.
Statistically speaking, yes, absolutely. I mean, there's more that goes into it, right? The people who have more money also have the time to study, right? The people who have the resources are able to take the test more than once, right? Some poor people can only get fee waivers for one test. They're supposed to be allowed to, but sometimes fee waivers are first come first serve, or some poor people don't even know that they can get fee waivers for the test. So there's a lot of reasons why rich people do better on the tests, but that's the most like clear bias or skewness when it comes to high test scores. There are obviously other reasons why students get high test scores too. Um, but like you said, right, it isn't applicable to everybody. Not everybody's good at math and isn't going to go into a STEM field. So why shouldn't there be a test, particularly for students who want to major in humanities?
Mm-hmm. Wow. I'm just like I'm kind of in shock right now. It just goes to show like how much of a systemic breakdown there is within the education system. And I really do hope, like I know we talked like how wealth really correlates with test scores. Like I wonder in my head, like for those who are kind of like in an unprivileged situation or don't have like the financial resources to really dedicate so much time to these exams, like how are the individuals who are recreating the exam past 2023, like how are they going to cater to those in that socioeconomic level?
I think that's going to be a hard problem. And then no matter what solution people come up with, it's always going to invite controversy.
Mm-hmm.
I think they can try to equalize the language, equalize the topics, but where people have money, they're always going to find ways to like try to get the extra hand, upper hand.
Right. So you've kind of like just been on both sides of the picture. You were an application reader, you were a college counselor. What would you say like have been what is right with the system and what is wrong with the or well, let's rephrase that. What is right with the system and what could be improved about the system in your opinion?
So, people in academia and education tend to be pretty liberal leaning, and so as part of it, they really focus on equity, inclusion, access, making sure that they look at students individually instead of like trying to like pigeonhole them. They really do a good job of trying to understand that. It wasn't actually until I started doing the admissions field that I started attending conferences and started learning all these things that are baked into American society in terms of biases, in terms of barriers and obstacles. And
Hmm.
I think from the education perspective, education as a whole does a pretty good job of trying to elevate those people who don't have as many opportunities. There's financial aid. A lot of colleges offer really great financial aid programs for students who can't afford the $60,000 tuition and cost of attendance. Um, a lot of colleges are actively working to make sure that students from rural backgrounds, underrepresented backgrounds, low income backgrounds have the opportunity to do well in education. Because if there's anybody who benefits the most from education these days, it's students who are in the bottom decile when it comes to income level. Those are the students who will truly benefit from a bachelor's degree. The rich kids are going to do fine. You know, they can get hired by mommy and daddy's,
Trust
whatever.
fund, yeah, or
Trust
sort of
fund. Yeah, yeah.
company.
Yeah. So honestly, and they've done studies on this too. Those kids, there is no difference whether they go to UPenn or Penn State. There really is no difference. So that's where I do think the education system uh, does help.
Mm.
Where I think the education system kind of fails is that they don't communicate that they have all these competing priorities when it comes to educating America. Their goal is not to educate based upon a meritocracy, and it hasn't been that case for a while. But people apply to college thinking that it is 100% a meritocracy when it really isn't.
I'm really interested. Can you elaborate on that point on the negative aspect when you say it's not in a meritocracy?
Let's just compare China. China is pretty cut off. If
Hmm.
you get a certain score on your exam, you can get into a certain college, and it's pretty easy. If you do well on the exam, you're set. If you do poorly on the exam, you either go to a lesser school or you wait a year to retake the exam. It's cut and dry, so there's no confusion whatsoever. So in the US, as I mentioned, a lot of schools, particularly private schools, do holistic admission. So that's where you may look at a student who has a 4.0 GPA and a 1600 SAT, but maybe they don't fit some other thing that you're looking for. So even though this student worked their butt off to do really well academically, they still won't get into such and such school for some other factor outside of their quote unquote merit.
What is the solution in that case? Are you saying that it should be more cut and dry, where if you take an exam, that should be the sole determination, or do you think it should be more holistic in that?
I agree more with the holistic part. I just wish colleges would communicate that better to families. But obviously, that's not in their best interest, right? Colleges' best interest is to make themselves seem like an untouchable pinnacle, so that they can continue having this, like, oh my gosh, brand name, shiny object mentality to them.
Right.
Um, so they have a reputation to uphold, so they're never going to admit that, you don't need to go to their school.
I'm really trying to understand this here. So let's just take like a very revered school, for example. I'm not going to just name names, but we're looking at a private school. Are you saying that they typically don't list what it is that they're looking for to have that sense of exclusivity? Is that right?
That's partially it, right? If they said exactly what we're looking for football players who have red hair, right? Then all of a sudden, those football players without red hair aren't going to apply anymore. So then their applications go down, then their rankings go down, then they look like a bad school, even though they aren't at the end of the day.
Ah, I see. So you want to, I guess, give the impression to prospective students that they have the chance to get to your school by not really discerning too much information to those students, so they will apply or regardless and hope to get in. When in reality, they're only accepting like maybe 5% of those students, right?
That's pretty much what it is. You summarized it pretty well. And so a lot of students who, like, realistically, when you look at a school that has an acceptance rate of 10%, that does not mean each student exactly has a 10% chance. Certain students have more closer to a 50% chance because they fit within the institutional priorities, whereas the students who don't have close to a 0% chance. But everybody looks at the admission rate and thinks of it like a lottery, right? If I apply to enough of these 10% schools, then, statistically, I will get one or two. When
Yeah,
in
so
reality, it doesn't work that way.
so you shouldn't go out and apply to all 10 of the top 10 schools who hire 10% of their students because you're going to get at least one of those colleges to accept you.
Right? That's statistically law of averages is you're going to get into one school. But that's not how it works. And I spend all day like trying to dispel those rumors. And even then, it's just people don't listen. And I like try to draw on my experiences, and people still don't listen. So that's where I'm kind of like I feel like I'm fighting a losing battle.
So do more students listen to you or do more students not listen to you?
Students somewhat listen to me.
I wonder if that's just kind of like a maturity thing, or if if there's just such a stigma or bias around the idea that they can get in because of that is what society tells them that they can
Well,
do.
it's you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? So they want to take some shots. And I mean, if I were in that situation again, I probably would take some shots.
Hmm.
But for a student to apply to the all top 10 schools blindly, it just is kind of a waste of time, in my opinion.
I'll be honest, a lot of these are just really incredible insights that I personally have never thought about, and it could have just been pure ignorance growing up that I never really took the time to consider the realities of the college application process. And I'm coming to admire more and more the work that college counselors do because it requires so much effort and dedication to like truly want to help students succeed in life. And I think that really brings me to the guts of this all, and that is kind of what is your advice for those who are looking to get into college admissions or counseling? Is there a specific personality type that you think would be like a great fit, or if is there something that someone should be looking for if they want to become a college counselor specifically?
You have to be really patient, and you have to love working with kids. I always knew that I'd be working with kids in some respect. I always wanted to be in education, even from a young age. I admired my teachers. Um, if you're going to work on the college admission side, until you get high up, you're going to make very little money. I guess that's true for education counseling too on the school side. That's the hardest part too. I think we don't invest enough as a country to do education. That's why a lot of people do like private services, and there's all these people who would like charge hundreds of thousands of dollars to like help kids write essays. That's a broken part of our system. I do believe that you really have to be passionate about it because you're not going to make a lot of money right off the bat.
That sounds a lot like education in general. You have to really have a passion for helping kids and helping them achieve things in life. You have to have the ability to really inspire those around you. And I think that's probably kind of what you're getting at as an integral point for anybody that's really interested in getting into college counseling or college admissions. It's not a flashy area. It's under, I guess, respect is not the right word, but undervalued, I think, is the better choice of words here. So you kind of have to like
The wrong
really,
groups of people.
yeah, yeah. You have to like really love what you do, and I have so much respect for college counselors in that regard because it's a hard job to do, and it's an effort to make the world a better place amongst a really broken system, Joey.
I will throw a wrench into it. If you do want to make money, here's one thing you can do.
Yeah,
You can
sure.
go work for a fancy private school. This is what some people have done. They work for a fancy private college that has, a really low percentage acceptance rate. You probably make on average like 50, 60,000, if that. And then you get hired by a fancy private school who'll pay you $100,000 to work with their kids.
That's a very fair point, but on the contrary to that, I mean, you can go work for those private schools doing that, but you're perpetuating a broken system in that regard.
Exactly.
You're kind
Exactly.
of You're alienating the students who are not in that socioeconomic group and all other students and kind of destroying the public school system really. And yeah, that's a whole other conversation, Joey. So yeah, we'll kind of avoid that one right now. So I'll be honest, this has probably been one of the most enlightening conversations I've had because there's just really so many aspects to it, and having a partner myself who's in the education system and hearing it day in and day out and then getting your perspective on it, Joey, it kind of just adds more light to the picture. So I first and foremost want to thank you for that. But again, before we close the show, I always ask my guests 5 closing questions. They're just quick questions that I thought are interesting. So um, we'll really just get going with those, and I'll jump right into the first question here for you. And that has been, or what has been the most fulfilling part about the work you do and the most challenging part?
The most fulfilling part for me is establishing connections with students, and having them create connections with me. Um, I I love being a mentor, but it makes me sad when students just kind of disappear. So I love it when I'm able to reconnect with students. And then I did mention the most challenging part is feeling sometimes like I'm crazy for trying to break some preconceived notions. Sometimes I'm
Mm.
like, am I even right? And so I just have to remind myself that, my experiences have led me to this, and I shouldn't stray from what I've seen or heard.
For students out there who haven't figured out what they want to do, but are close to graduating high school, for example, do you have any words of wisdom to kind of help them navigate through that?
Um, if you're not entirely sure what you want to do and you plan on going to college, make sure you go to a college where it's okay to not know what you want to do. Not every school is cut out for that. And if you need time to figure that out, save money by going to community college, taking a gap year, and working. But don't feel that you have to go to college right away, especially if you're not going to know what you're going to do.
You are given the opportunity to come up with your own admissions criteria for college. What would be the 3 most important things you look for?
Since my background is in testing, I would look for some high aptitude in some way of whatever it is to show off your skills. So some sort of aptitude, and I wouldn't rely on grades because grades are inflated and can be like,
Right.
biased. Some sort of standardized aptitude assessment. I'd look for somebody who is able to present well. I would really want to find a way beyond just an interview or an essay to gauge a student's like moral standing. I really wish I could find a better way. Letters of recommendation are biased, essays are biased, interviews are biased. I think those would be my two career criteria, honestly, being able to find a great aptitude and being able to assess a student's moral character.
What is the book or books you've given most as a gift and why?
I don't give books, which I should. But there's a couple books that I would recommend is Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be. That's an excellent case study on people who found immense success in life without going to the fanciest school. And the other one is David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell. It reinforces the notion that you don't have to be at the fanciest place to do your best. You can be the big fish in a small pond at some lesser known school and still do just as well.
And the last question, Joey. What is one of the best or most worthwhile investments you've ever made? It could be an investment of money, time, energy, etc.
I think the most worthwhile is the college admissions workshop that I try to put on every year, in which I try to bring students together to work through what it is like in a holistic admissions office. We spend the week just going through the entire application process, and a lot of the conversations we have had, I try to like help students understand that too.
Those have been some incredibly fascinating answers. So I do appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that, and also sharing your thoughts on all things college education and admissions. And before we go, I always also like to share with listeners out there contact information, social media. I do understand that you have your own company called Thinque Prep, in which you do college counseling for students. So if you have some way, if people are interested in learning more about the work you do, following you on social media, interested in contacting you, how could they do so, Joey?
Any handle is Think Prep, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. It's ThinQuePrep, and then the website is thinkprep.com.
Perfect. So I'll go ahead and add those books as well as the links to your social and Think Prep in the description of the episode. But again, Joey, this has been
Time is the most valuable thing that a man can spend.
Thank you again. And that will do it for this episode.
Man has
Time for all things
Time to think, to plan, meditate. Man has Man Energy is a timeless force.